This is the film I told you about. The first film people paid to go to a theatre and watch. A busy scene of happy enough looking French workers opening the gates and leaving a factory. The film travelled the world, but like the factories and warehouses that seem nowadays to be somewhat out of sight, out of mind. Having paid to be entertained, would seeing these workers leaving their factory give the faintest glimpse of life inside those gates? Or the slightest whiff of the financial forces hovering around outside? And the men behind the camera, who filmed this place in this way? They were, of course, the factory owners. And these are some frames we filmed in the 1970s. Workers who downed tools when they or their fellows were being ill-treated. But there was one important event we didn't film. Not the most visual or dramatic. A story that, like, no one with a camera came close to fully telling.
A great fog seemed to be hanging over us. It was the title of the second of what she called her film letters, made with footage she'd shot or borrowed, aka stolen, and somehow managed to upload to my inbox on New Year's Day 2015. Grandma was on one of her film trips and had been looking forward to revisiting a city she often reminisced held the most precious of her 70s memories. The first time she'd filmed sheer joy of power being challenged from below. After the army rebelled against the colonial war and the dictator was forced by popular demand to flee. But that day, 40 years on, standing at the river's edge, the town itself seemed to have disappeared. Many of my generation had already departed, unable to make a living here, and spurred on by a prime minister advising anyone with a university education and a wish for a future to pack up and leave. Passing through the airport, their eyes no doubt like hers, being taken aback by a gigantic billboard bearing a magnificent vista of this bridge, announcing in English and Chinese, much of this country is being put up for sale. And as she stood there, filming, the cloud assembling on the far bank of the river brought to her mind that unlike the countless news we'd been watching, of columns of displaced souls seeking work or fleeing wars to be washed up on shores like this, unlike these souls, it's big money that moves freely, relentlessly, in the background, obscured from view. And as the sun receded and the fog moved back in, one thing at least, she insisted, was crystal clear. With a mere handful of people now owning more wealth than half the population of the planet, and cities turned into speculative money-making opportunities, with my generation being squeezed out of our hometowns. How could anyone with an ounce of sense hold on to that well-trodden mantra of always creating a climate for investors, that blind faith in following the money that sure as night follows day had got us into this insipid soup?
I don't like going out to work at 5 o'clock at night. I don't like going out cleaning up the dirt and the muck in the coal office. I don't do it because I like it.
And you were supposed to work long hours from 8 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock. And the wages were very low, and all the time you were pushed around to do the work.
And another thing, it's hard enough to get a flat now with kids. But I mean, if you do, you're paying something like 10 quid a week. Now, I mean, how many people, let's face it, can pay 10 quid a week in rent? This rent rises, the food prices are going up, and now the school milk.
And early next morning, bound for her return flight, 70s memories mingling with the present, and gradually realizing she was in the presence of bodies who still miraculously appear each day to keep the wheels of this world turning. In that ghostly, on the way to work silence, she began to recall traces of that half-remembered story, the one she didn't film, but now realized shed more than a little light on the predicament we're still in.
The South Birmingham area was mainly aircraft equipment, but they were also producing control units that were fitted on Bren gun carriers and tanks.
The military predominated. We made combustion chambers for jet engines, thrust reversers to slow aircraft down on landing, and we had a massive research facility that did research into jet engine combustion.
And the Burnley plant also made the Phantom bomber reheat. It was a massive plane. They still have one or two. In fact, the Americans use them for hospital freighting in Afghanistan and wherever.
But this, she insisted, was just the preamble, their journey's start. For 40 years ago, when faced with the threat of their factories closing, these younger men dared to suggest alternatives to making jet engines.
They expressed their great anxiety about the future of their company and the prospects for employment. And I said to them, well, look, why don't you go away, and as I suggested to them, and do a corporate strategy for your own company, based on your own knowledge of the company, of the equipment, of the skills, of the market available, and they did. And it's one of the most remarkable exercises that's ever occurred in British industrial history.
We took the view that it was no good just waiting until the problems were on us and then whining to the government or to the TUC or whoever that we want the right to work. We thought that we have a very highly skilled, very competent workforce, and we have the intelligence amongst ourselves to devise or endeavour to solve the problems for ourselves.
Refusing to be mere numbers of economic collateral damage, they would use their skills to address needs they saw all around them.
Because it's a very small step to go from power generators on aircraft to wind turbines.
Wind turbines, a fully functioning hybrid car, a road rail vehicle, and all manner of social and environmentally sustainable alternatives.
It's a range of alternative products and alternative ways of working which we believe will guarantee the future not only of our workforce but of many other workers in British industry.
Medical equipment, sustainable heating systems, energy efficient, low-cost housing. And the more she recalled of what they'd achieved, she couldn't help but ask what she called that achingly simple question.
Why had this story no trip down memory lane, but ever more pertinent in our climate changing here and now? Why had their story become somehow lost in the mist of time?
And then Grandma's third letter arrived.
Chile, 9/11, 1973. Forces were emerging that would ride roughshod over the Lucas aerospace or any other alternative workers' plans. A socialist government being bombed out of existence by a military coup. People of your age had been taking an active role in politics during 3 years of radical social change. And now, neoliberal economics, what we came to call Thatcherism, was being installed. Public assets will be privatised, social welfare cut, and trade unions banned. Over 40,000 were arrested. Many simply disappeared.
I know how much we owe to you. I'm also very much aware that it's you who brought democracy to Chile, for beginning a new era in Chile, one which is founded on true democracy.
Estamos muy conscientes y sabemos que fue usted el que trajo el regreso a la democracia a Chile.
Anybody who looks like a doctor's car or pickets, wave it in. Same procedure. Everybody off, search the coach. The police go right through the clothing, frisk them all the way down, and just stop in and harass them all the time.
The situation changed just at the end of the 70s. This sort of consensus that existed that the trade unions, that it was part of the way Britain was run. And I think that went out of the window. And such ideas that we were putting forward could no longer be accepted, that we had to be put in our place.
Enough is enough. It's
Enough is enough.
That's it.
Enough is enough.
That's it.
Stand by, guys. Here we go.
I presume this is to enable us to sweep Britain clean of socialism.
Any mother will tell you that if you're just over soft and sympathetic without being firm,
a change that we're still living with was underway, sold through the image of a thrifty housewife cleansing the world of every last trace of socialism, yet alone workers and their plans. She unleashed the same fairy tale freedoms as her oh-so Prince Charming.
We changed the system back to free enterprise. We didn't invent it. We just uncovered it again.
And you fought a bruising battle.
And it blossomed.
With the trade unions.
Yes, I did. They got far too many powers.
A paradise for the powerful, where trade unions would be suppressed and wealth unleashed, no longer trickling, but gushing upwards as the gap between the working majority and the moneyed elite massively widened. For as every thrifty housewife should know, free markets are always rigged in favour of those with the biggest wallet. As deregulation opened the floodgates to financial profiteers, and the special offers that sold it, owning your home, morphed into generation rent, a nation of investors into 500 billion of public debt. And all along, in this blind rush, inspired one way or another by greed, not only credit, but the earth's temperature soared.
In politics, if you want anything said, ask a man. If you want anything done, ask a woman.
And for all the talk of democracy and freedom, the gap between them would shrink to a whisper.
She was right to understand the sense of aspiration of people across the country. She was right to recognize our economy needed to change. She was right, and I honor her personal achievements.
The phrase, a one-party state, comes to mind. For having danced the Pied Piper's tune, they all but disappeared, having nothing of an alternative nature to say.
Their story, she wrote, stopped in its prime, had offered just that.
They were living in communities where people were dying of hypothermia because they couldn't get a simple heating system, whereas during the day they were working on a level of technology which was producing concord, and that to them was an incredible contradiction.
And that would represent an enormous shift, that a workforce is trying to determine what it should be making and how it should be making and how that should apply to society at large.
Because the way society is organized in general, and industry in particular, is to set out to make people not think about what they're doing or how they do it or why they're doing it. So we really had to reverse that process.
One thing in all this was bugging me though. They'd worked for years without thinking too much about what they were doing. Maybe even on... Isn't that a bit of a socialist contradiction?
There's certainly plenty of them. But as the saying goes, this wasn't built in a day. And certainly not by anyone from the Caesar family.
It was a process. People evolved.
To start with, your question, your right to survive. Your right to survive in a modern society demands that you work. And on the first principle of that, you'll go and work for anything, to do anything.
When you're looking for a job, you're looking for a job to feed your wife and kids.
Survival.
And survival, you know, and unfortunately you don't make choices. Some people do, some very principled people make a decision not to work in the arms industry or whatever, but you go to a company because you're going to get paid and you're going to feed your wife and kids and whatever.
And then when you get settled in, you get more confident, you're then entitled to say, well, why am I doing this? All right?
It was this simple question: why are we making this? That would evolve into their alternative plan. A plan that would question not only this world they'd been part of making, but the top-down commands and controls. Military jets and management systems seemed to always share.
Recovery from fatigue, 1.62 minutes. 1.6 or 1.7, it's computer precise, 1.62. And the toilets, incidentally, have been strategically placed close to the production line. Sitting down after standing too long, 65 seconds. For monotony, 32 seconds. Now, we say that that form of technology is unacceptable. And if the only way to build cars and products of that kind is to use that kind of technology, then we should be questioning whether we should be making those kind of products in that sort of way at all.
It was this, and what she called those other, too often unasked, inconvenient questions about how we produce and consume. How we might reverse the destructive, she actually said, fucked up nature of this process, that their alternative plan would start to unravel and address.
This makes sense because we now have an ultimate 80s weapon of fire and throw away.
This was their journey, their challenge to this throwaway attitude towards human and natural resources, in which we all, to some extent, participate. This was the far more reaching story a film letters wanted to tell.
As far as I was concerned,
We were very
I went into a factory when I was 28. I never worked in a factory before. I've worked in small companies and I've been in forces. I went in this factory and then I realised that the saying master and servant actually applies. And it absolutely struck me. As soon as you walk through the factory gates, you said you live in a free society, you live in a democratic society. As soon as you walk through them factory gates, you leave your democracy and you leave your freedom. Because you're now a chattel in a factory and you do nothing other than what you're told. We have the lower ranks, the sergeants, foremen, etc., whose basic role is to control people. They might be called supervisors or whatever, but they're there to control people. And the people who are doing the work, actually doing it. And if they want to get your job and break it into little bits, and you do that bit and you do that bit, that's what they'll do. And you have no say in it whatsoever. Even the way you work is gone back into the power of the management. They come along and say, you don't do it that way, you do it our way. And it's all about profit. It's not about the product you make, you take great pride in it. It's not about that, it's about making a profit. If you don't make a profit, you're on the door.
And if you were sick, you didn't have any pay, and the staff, if they were sick, they had to pay. So that was a sort of concentrate the mind, as you think, well, that seems unfair. I mean, there's no high-flying, but it was just a question of seeing the unfairness of it and the way things were within the factory, trying to resist to what the management are doing.
It's hard to feel the pressures behind these images. We're not trapped in the world that produces them, or the full force of the rationale at work behind these facades. In my system, pined Frederick Winslow Taylor, the founder of production line thinking, the workman is told precisely what to do and how to do it. And any improvement upon the instructions given is disastrous for success. All necessary movements were recorded and tasks specified to the last detail. A cooperation, he called it, in his idealized world of maximized efficiency. The happiness on these faces, leaving Fords at the end of a night shift, tell a different story.
But thinking back to your first image, showing assembly line workers also begs the question, surely your story is about skilled precision engineers, smaller scale production, and at the height of British trade union power.
It may not appear as extreme as, but once through those company gates, there seems to be a strange kind of global equality at work. Free, certainly, of time and place.
you had an whole system of white-collar workers who had to come and time you. It wouldn't just be clocking you what you were doing, it could also be deciding that you weren't doing it right. A very demeaning way of working. They were finding ways and means of breaking the toolmaker's job down. You get a tool room jig borer, you get a tool room turner, you get a tool room fitter, where at one time a toolmaker used to do everything. But now they were breaking them down slowly but surely. You had to break the work down into the smallest part so that an idiot could do it, and you would then give a time to each part, sometimes in seconds. He would then have an allowance to give you, going to the toilet 2%, 3%. Then he'd come back and give the operator a value. Now I'm giving you 5 minutes for the work. So they determine not only how you work and what you do, they also determine what you'll be paid and why you'll be paid that. And the operator would say, go away. And then there'd be a big argument. And then they'd come to the steward, and these were all the sort of things that we were arguing about. How you got paid, why you got paid more than him, why he should be paid more than him or her. And these were all the issues that you dealt with on a shop floor. And you used to scratch your head and say, there must be more to life than this.
Did we see it within a political context? You know, had we got sort of, could see what was going on in the bigger picture? No. As Mick has said, we were reacting to situations. We was trying to get another 1% on the pay increase, or we were trying to resist the redundancy. We was always reacting to a situation that was taking place. I think it was only later that we started to, certainly I did, when I started to look at how much tax Lucas was paying, for example, or how much they weren't paying, the kind of grants that were going to industry, how the workforce was declining in Britain compared with Europe, for example. Manufacturing, you could see it then, but that we wasn't looking at that round about the end of the 60s, beginning of the 70s, were we?
Nobody ever discussed investment policies, or not a shop floor. Yeah. No way. I mean, you didn't go near them, you know, because they were seen as management prerogatives. You could work in the prerogatives that you had very narrowly, but you couldn't go into them sort of areas. I mean, they were just out of bounds. And by the way, the unions would have probably knocked you back if you'd have gone that into that, really. They thought that was an absolute prerogative. It's management prerogative.
Markets are ruled right now by fear. Investors and the big money, the smart money, the hedge funds, the institutions, they're moving their money away to safer assets.
Can you pin down exactly what would keep investors happy, make them feel more confident?
That's a tough one. I go with what if I see an opportunity to make money, I go with that. So for most traders, it's not about that we don't really care that much how they're going to fix the economy, how they're going to fix the whole situation. Our job is to make money from it, and it's an opportunity.
We had a notification of 1,000 redundancies when Rolls-Royce went bust. They picked people out and they were going to massive redundancies.
Up to about 71, as you say, it was expanding, wasn't it?
Yes. Oh,
Taking,
yeah.
But after 71, after Rolls-Royce collapse, then things started to be cut back, as you say, the strategy that was had.
Bear in mind, those who look down on this world as an opportunity to make money were busy in the 1970s betting against and distorting minor things like national currencies and world commodity prices, or having endless office blocks built and leaving them empty while their value increased on the property market. This one in central London for over 10 years. Down on earth, fixing the economy, as the trader so quaintly put it, was seen as the responsibility of governments long before the 2008 bank bailouts.
I was an apprentice in 1971, training in the Rolls-Royce Technical College in Filton in Bristol. And I can remember being called into the lecture room to be told that the Prime Minister of the day, Edward Heath, had taken 24 hours to nationalise Rolls-Royce, taking it through every stage of parliamentary procedure without a single moan from capitalism, because of the central role that that firm played in engineering, the defence industry.
A war comes along, or a crisis exists in one particular industry, and that philosophy that everything is self-rectifying, what they call the hidden hand of the market, that ideology goes out of the window. They're quite open about the need for some kind of planning mechanism to be introduced.
These companies, these people who've made profits out of our industry, they've gained so much from public investment.
The first of Lucas's many benefits being an expansion of their Burnley works into premises that had been repossessed by government during World War II. But the extent of what Brian would come to call corporate welfare was only uncovered after he and the Lucas shop stewards started to dig deeper. The constant drip of public funding in the form of capital grants, tax benefits, transport, energy and other subsidies being funneled to all kinds of private business. Estimated by researchers at York University to have grown under every party to a staggering $93 billion a year by 2016. Along, of course, with ministers supporting business roles.
My analysis is that we became technocrats and managers of our society rather than people who seemed like we wanted to change it. And people lost a sense of what we stood for and what we believed in, and that's what we need to get back to. We became technocrats and managers rather than people who seemed like we wanted to change it.
This silent Russian film of a party leader ascending the steps of state power, she felt illustrated his analysis well. But this kind of career-driven becoming, she insisted, couldn't be laid at the door of Labour's Prime Minister during the 1960s and 70s. Harold Wilson had a head start, beginning life as a technocrat and manager, head of statistics for the Ministry of Fuel and Power.
He appeared later on holding the pipe, and the left hand would go like that on the face, And that had a double bonus because it had all sorts of other sort of wonderful, the wedding ring and the rest, you know, it all came out, wonderful picture of sort of the comfortable, dependable, reassurance. I mean, the images were really very effective.
Belying this carefully crafted image, Wilson had much in common with Frederick Taylor's so-called scientific management philosophy, and was enamoured by industrialist Arnold Weinstock's GEC, where local managers were forced to deliver centrally set production targets, and profits had soared. Seeking to emulate this, he established an industrial reorganization corporation that publicly funded companies like Weinstock's and Lucas on a grand scale to buy up their less profitable competitors and become monopolies, large enough to compete with the big boys of the world market. All couched, of course, in reassuring tones of socialist values.
In all our plans for the future, we are redefining and we are restating our socialism in terms of the scientific revolution. But that revolution cannot become a reality unless we are prepared to make far-reaching changes in economic and social attitudes which permeate our whole system of society.
And here came the bonus for the rest of us.
The Britain that is going to be forged in the white heat of this revolution will be no place for restrictive practices or for outdated methods on either side of industry.
The preparation for that infamous line, "There is no alternative," featuring the less bright side of his white heat's technological force.
Never tires, never needs a break. It's never absent, 3 shifts a day. It works for about $6 an hour, no fringes.
As we've learned to our cost, in Japan, loyalty to the company is so strong that workers take less holiday time than they're due and rarely go on strike. On TV sets alone, they turn out 1 million units every 2 months.
Am I projecting? Or does he look distinctly sheepish, knowing where his industrial reorganization corporation would be leading?
Harold Wilson was trying to shed the weakest parts of, let's say, Lucas Aerospace, keep the best parts to keep a core of the workforce together, but to get shut of the rest of it, to make, as in their terms, a leaner and fitter aerospace industry to take on the Americans, and therefore what followed hand in glove. Let's get rid of people and make them as, first of all, as productive as the German workers, and then they started saying, make them as productive as the Japanese workers. When we went over there, we realised the Japanese were being told you ought to be as productive as the English workers, and saying the same to the Germans, actually. The model of, we want to get rid of some of you, the rest of you will have to work harder.
That was always the cry. If you don't want to do it, then we'll move it abroad, you know. And when you're dealing with multinationals, which Lucas Aerospace was a multinational, they have the world to play with. And you have to look at the background. Lucas Aerospace had just grown fantastically by buying other companies. It had built up to 18,000 by just buying other companies. And when you buy all these other companies, you see, looking at it from a management perspective, well, Do we need to duplicate here, there and everywhere, right? When you buy that company and they're doing something that they're doing there, we don't want that. We'll take that from there and put it there, and we'll move that from here and put it there, and we don't want that on board. And it's also got to be seen, because the one example that we all looked at with horror was Weinstock and GEC. He was buying British industry, was Weinstock, and he was shutting it down. And he cut thousands and thousands and thousands of jobs and informing GEC. And behind Weinstock, informing GEC into the company it became, was the government. Not the Tory government, because Tories don't get involved in that unless they nationalise Rolls-Royce, but it was a Labour government that was behind him. They just give Weinstock loads of money to go and do it.
And Lucas, they gave money as well.
They giving them handouts left, right and centre to rationalise the industry. 100 jobs here, 500 there, 300 here, 200 there, week after week after week after week.
40 pounds, 2658, 40, 30, 20, 10, 5 I've got, 6,
And
9,
after the Weinstock method of reducing the workforce, profits were up to 105 million.
got 70 here, in a black coat at 75, 80, 80, 85.
On a very small scale compared to Weinstock, Lucas Aerospace was doing exactly the same thing.
40, 30, 20, 10, 5 I've got, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2658.
That's really the start of the destruction of British manufacturing.
Well, if that's the only future I've got to offer to my kids, God knows what I can do about it. I've got 2 boys that will be leaving school in 2-3 years' time, right? And what have they got to look forward to? Christ, I've got nothing to look forward to. What are they going to have?
People had kids coming out of school that couldn't get an apprenticeship. They were on the dole, they'd been on the dole for a while. So the job as we saw it was to preserve the number of jobs. It was a sensitivity. You know, your job isn't yours to sell. That was the policy adopted by the Shop Stewards Committee.
I mean, we saw people in Liverpool who were in 3rd generation, 4th generation on the dole, right? It's the social cost of being in that situation, not just the fact that you get what they call government handouts. It's the social cost of what happens to them families and the children. What expectations do they have? How are they going to relate to the rest of society? It's all these things that are just ignored. They're never taken into account. So it's not just private company make profit. Private company makes profit, but it makes profit based on tax-based contributions, in the case that we're talking about. And then, once it's got its profit, right, sack them. They're no longer our affair. They're no longer anything to do with us as managers. It's your problem now. And then the government, who is there to solve their problem, doesn't. It just puts a source of security. What about them people? What about them people and the families? What can you do to alter that? Nothing. It's up to the market. No, it's not. It's up to society.
Because we were aware of the pent-up anger and frustration, of small redundancies here and there with the cumulative effect of mass unemployment. We're not going to be hungry. We'll fight when we're in the yards and in the factories, and not when we're in the dole shoes. We refuse to accept a philosophy that says that economics control men. Men must and shall control economics. Representing the workers are in control of this yard. Nobody and nothing will come in, and nothing will go out without our permission. The gate man is there. We'll take the decision with your endorsement that determines what comes in or out this yard.
All those in favour? Carried unanimously.
In 1972, we were on the Upper Clyde. Wilson and Labour had lost the 1970 election, and when the Tory government announced the closure of 3 shipyards, keeping only the naval base and axing 6,000 jobs, the shop stewards took control in a direct challenge to management prerogatives.
There are no tugs going to be used in this river to shift any ships in any of the yards down to Liverpool, the continent. Get back to your shipyards and factories tomorrow. You've just got no idea how enthusiastic the people are to help the UCS lads.
And thousands of others didn't just rally around the UCS working, but took over their threatened works.
It's immoral, it's any obscene even, to think that somebody can fly over here from Miami Beach or wherever he lives, kick 46 people out on the rubbish dump and get away with it. Why should he be allowed to?
There were real stirrings against the domination of financial interests she enthused, and the new drudgery government-funded technology seemed to be bringing.
Millions paid out annually to private corporations from the public purse. A redefining of socialism, indeed. Watching this and being there can't really compare. 16 ocean-going ships were built, without a stopwatch or an overseer in sight.
I don't believe that anyone can or should condemn any action the men of UCS take within the law. It will be different, of course, if any action were taken outside the law. let's get back to normal working and normal entry into and exit from the yard.
Pipe is ever in hand. A somewhat troubled leader of the opposition could only appeal for normal, everyday managerial control.
Here you have a group of workers are saying, we are not leaving our place of employment, and if you want a discussion, come into the yards and talk to us. That's what's significant, and that's what's historic.
At a specially convened conference of the Scottish TUC, a bank of union officials wore equally concerned looks. TUC head Vic Feather, being particularly affected by the debate on how to take the movement forward, don't wake him just yet. As one Lucas Stewart commented, all you could expect from some trade union officials was neutrality at best.
Only the rank and file could really sort out their own problems. The officials weren't going to, with nothing against the officials, but they just weren't going to solve them. 10,000 go down the road from a plant, the official didn't lose his job. They didn't really understand, they didn't know. So the thing is, how do we get an organisation?
Grassroots.
Right, looked at from a rank and file point of view.
It was only in her 7th letter that she revealed the Lucas shop steward's Achilles heel, and what would eventually become a strength when making their alternative plan. Theirs wasn't one large factory threatened with closure. There were 17 aerospace factories spread the length and breadth of the country. And to make matters worse, 11 different trade unions, covering both blue-collar workers and the staff.
Not the easiest of groups to combine.
Anybody hadn't got a brilliant plan, let's do a combine because that's politically good. You know, we did it because it was absolutely essential. Especially when you got staff workers and manual workers under different conditions of service. They used to play off the manual workers against the staff workers. You know, that's how they used to do it. So they sort of controlled individuals. So you had to develop a structure within your plant so that you had a cohesive approach to what management were trying to do. And then, obviously, with so many other sites around, they used to play one off against another one.
And them sort of questions start to say, well, you know, you really need to swap information. I mean, you haven't got the information to management knew, but we didn't. And in fact, I don't think the Burnley management knew what they paid him in Birmingham, and the Birmingham management knew what they paid him in Liverpool or anything. But the board did.
So it was very necessary to pull it together.
By going round and talking to one another.
And examples. If you had, as we did, the electronics factory that was going to be moved out of Birmingham. And we stuck together and kept the workforce together without them being made redundant on the basis of working together as unions. And that was when, if you like, the Combine Committee in Birmingham showed its teeth, managed to get together, hold it all together, make sure that the workforce were not sacked, and also make sure that the electronics was going to remain in Birmingham. And we fought the company and said, if you don't put it there, there's going to be trouble, you're going to be strikes and whatever. And we want that one. We could show that it actually worked. That was the only way that you could get credibility for an organisation which we were creating, by winning things. Redundancies were not taking place.
And Burnley in 71, and we were on strike, and we had all the sites out, and the company, they locked us out, got security out there and locked them out, and then the lads came, the women as well, they all came out, and we were on strike, and they come up from all over, you know, Liverpool, Wilston, they all come up to the shop stewards, they addressed the mass meetings, and that started to break down the secrecy of sites and the rates they paid, and the mood changed, it really did, because then they promised that they'd start levies to send up money, and they gave us a massive support. And Burnley really started to agree that we should talk to the staff and bring the staff onto the committee and all the rest of it. And after seeing that, I mean, the psychological effect it had on Lucas, they'd never seen anything like it in Burnley, ever.
Those in favour, please show.
And after seeing that, I mean, that was it. You know, they knew we meant business and they knew we could pull it off. And you'd have no problems convincing the Burnley workforce about the combine. I mean, they were absolutely convinced.
So, by 1974, all of the Lucas Aerospace sites were sending delegates to the combine meetings.
The present British trade union structure cannot cope with a multinational, multi-union, multi-plant company.
The operations are quite vast. They range from a 25% stake in a people's cooperative in Yugoslavia, which they purchased this year, to the proposed plant in South Korea.
This company firstly makes a profit of 76.2 million. They've had 56 million pounds in deferred tax from the government this year, taxpayers' money. They've had 38 million last year.
And this is basically what it's all about now. It's got nothing to do with management techniques, it's got nothing to do with streamlining the business. It's all done in terms of profit. But who pays for the profit in the end?
Ron took me to a combine meeting and showed me the sort of debate that took place in those meetings. I was nervous at first about getting involved in that sort of organisation because they were something. There were people there who knew how to handle themselves and knew how to represent their members. They weren't just on the shop floor. I mean, some shop stewards, when they get the job, they're looking to get a job within the company. But these people were professionals. They were professional shop stewards, really, and it was amazing.
They now want to sack a further 2,000 people. We've got 1.6 million people out of work, and I believe we fail to understand how important useful, meaningful work is to human beings. And I think our society will have to pay dearly for what it's now doing to its young people.
I was really impressed by the numbers of like-minded individuals who were no longer interested in simply reacting to the company's decisions, but they were more interested in anticipating the company's rationalisation moves and taking a proactive approach.
We became more confident in as much that we'd now got the workforce as a whole to develop tactics across the aerospace sites. All the task members in the technical areas, as from a given date, stopped clocking in. We used to have to clock in and clock out. And actually it was through Ron as the liaison officer organised that across all of the sites, all the technical areas, as from Monday the so-and-so date, we will stop clocking in. And the company accepted that after a given time. They threatened us with all sorts, stopping our money and whatever, but in the end they accepted it, and in the end we didn't have to clock in anymore. Liaison officer.
It was only later, editing, that she began to realise the full significance of what Brian had said, to understand Ron's key role in the Combine, and why many of the images she'd been showing me were in fact filmed during other industrial battles. Railway workers, miners, dockers, shipyard and car workers. Like Ron, the quiet one, their resistance had grown out of the limelight of the more public dramas they knew so well. Yet there was, she insisted, something special about this organisation they'd forged, as egalitarian as it was invisible to those outside. Combine meetings could only make recommendations that had to be taken back and voted on by each individual union on all 17 of the company's sites. Like a sort of mini-EU without a central power or bureaucracy.
I was starting to see them more like those gallant British squaddies in World War II movies, who always outsmarted their German prison guards. And like in the best of those resistance films, the liaison officer,
getting anything?
Unknown to the company, was using one of their office phones. If Lucas tried to move plants and equipment or close a site down, Ron would let people know what was happening. Machines put to one side, idle, and the company left to think again. If more decisive action was needed, there were no spontaneous mass walkouts. A key group such as drivers delivering urgent aircraft spares were down tools. Ron ringing around the sites to raise a levy on all 12,000 Combine members to ensure those out on strike got paid. They were not simply reacting now, but starting to engage the company's rationalisation moves.
Because you could see, even though you had got a Combine, they were still trying to reduce the numbers of people working there. So then you had to look at the broader company policy.
The world around us was changing. We'd been used to boom and bust cycles of the economy, and jobs would go and the same jobs would come back. What we were now looking at was changing. New technology particularly was giving rise to structural unemployment, jobs that were going that would never ever come back. All the white heat of the technological revolution did was simply to burn up our members' jobs, and the intensification of the work rate. And the shop stewards were looking at ways to combat that idea, and ways to begin to influence the whole process of investment and company strategy.
Good evening. Labour's overall majority looks like being 3. Mr. Wilson has called for a united country to beat the economic crisis.
Our workers in every industry, our scientists and engineers, our designers, are now on their mettle. And any who fail through laziness or self-seeking, any who frustrate the work of others by unofficial strikes, will imperil the right to work not only of themselves, but of the nation.
And let those who will be embarking upon trade union conferences and settling their wage claims, let them all remember, every wage rise which is not met by higher production is a ticket straight to the dole queue. We cannot throw away the prospects for the next decade because of short-term impatience over the next 12 months.
In government circles, beyond the perennial call to tighten belts, policies were beginning to emerge that they would later call Thatcherism.
She'd shown me at the beginning where this drive to double profits would eventually lead. A million miles from those actually doing the work having any kind of say. But how, she wanted to recall, had it begun? Recollecting the stern words and threatening gestures of two Labour Prime Ministers and their demand for more. It had, she remembered thinking, become something of a topsy-turvy world, as she filmed a headline quoting the General Secretary of Britain's largest trade union, calling for 1977 to be the year of the beaver, the hard-working beaver. And the head of the coal miners' union imploring them to forgo their aspirations and simply dig for the nation. It all seemed more in tune with the Tory shadow minister who'd called overmanning evil.
I mean, that sort of performance is obviously not on. I'm saying, frankly, through you right now to the workforce.
My view, said Sir Michael Edwards, of nationalised BL cars, is that there is a troublesome 1% who are damned irresponsible. They represent an inherent defection in the British industrial character. They are an insidious, undermining factor. And to top it off, the General Secretary of the Transport and General Workers and President of the Engineers Union appeared in an advert either side of Sir Michael, fully cooperating on the same side of his work harder fence.
What of the wreckers? Those who strike without cause? What of those who will not work? Those who thump the elderly, smash in the windows, and thrive on a life of crime?
In the world we were filming, rank-and-file trade unionism had been evolving. Engineers at Rolls-Royce Glasgow refused to work on the jets used in the Chilean coup when they returned for servicing and left them outside to rot. These North London postmen would go on to propose boycotting apartheid South African mail and were now withholding the post of a local mail order photo processing company that offered a prompt service at a very competitive price. In this instance, forcing its Asian employees to work long unsocial hours, forego holidays, and be paid, in the words of a Times editorial, highly competitive, that is, low wages.
What do you think you've got to gain after you've had the advice from Tom Jackson that you should be going back to work? What's that? You should be going back to work.
Are you still prepared to go ahead with this action then, despite instructions from the union and the fact that
each branch is autonomous until itself. They make the decision, our branch is decided. Thank you, gentlemen.
Would you be prepared to step in
In a period of high unemployment, the Times editorial had gone on to reason it is only natural for coloured workers to accept jobs on these terms. Whether local or global in spread, these grassroots solidarity actions were challenging not only management prerogatives, but the other pillar of that supposed natural order, self-interest. The what have I got to gain motive. It was this sense of social values, support and solidarity, that was at the heart of what we had been witnessing.
This party, we shall not be moved.
And who had they been turning to for help?
Wilson and his employment secretary, Barbara Castle, tried to bring in new laws to curb the unions.
She and Harold Wilson shared a common purpose, the need to produce a plan for trade union reform and thus to pinch the Tories close.
I produced In Place of Strife. Barbary said, you haven't out-Heath Heath. You have out-manoeuvred him.
Re-looking at the frame she'd filmed. Recall the common stance of governments inextricably headed towards scenes fit for a civil war. This final escalation, after 15 years of attacks, had seen the Crown forces actually gain little success. Barbara Castle's In Place of Strife had been resisted and never became law. When the next Tory government created an industrial relations court that imprisoned 5 dockers, she filmed the instantaneous uproar. As trade unionists across the country came to the dockers' support.
Because every one of these papers has supported the Industrial Relations Act.
And filmed the headline announcing that day's news.
The mail is beating right now, and it looks as though that's going to close for the night. The mail of the Sun, the Telegraph, Express, and all stuff in.
later that year, she filmed engineers arriving in their thousands to support striking miners in their battle to close the gates of a major fuel depot and break through a government-imposed wage freeze. And the government retreat at the end of that long day. And when the miners struck for a second time in as many years, Edward Heath called a snap election with the slogan, "Who runs Britain?" and lost.
And the topsy-turvy world did seem to spin momentarily in our direction. Even Wilson, back in number 10, thanks to a strike, seemed caught up in the moment.
Things have got to be more fairly shared out. We can't afford speculators taking large sums out of the large cuts off the national cake, which they've done nothing to produce before. It's shared out among the people who did. And you know, only this week we've seen the banks announcing great profits. They're very shamefaced and sheepish about it, but that's what happens inevitably with high interest rates. They are just coining money.
With the manifesto making no small claim, a fundamental and irreversible shift in the balance of wealth and power in favour of working people. And Tony Benn, from the more radical wing of the party, installed as Minister of Industry. Was this more than a new pose?
'74, Labour were elected with quite a radical manifesto. Ben was at the top then. I mean, he was doing particularly well. He was in trade and industry. And he was always willing to meet with shop stewards, which was unusual from the point of view of somebody in that position.
I think he was very impressed with Jimmy Early and Jimmy Reid up on the Upper Clyde and the takeover of the shipyards. I think that's what got his mind going about the involvement of workers.
We felt there was the opportunity there, that there was some kind of sympathy from the Labour government and some forthcoming legislation which would allow what we were doing to have some more legitimacy.
He'd just had meetings very recently with the workers from Alfred Herbert Machine Tools and Ferranti's as well. And they'd gone to him after the bomb had dropped, and they were, he said, looking for bailouts. He said, well, I just can't do that. And he did point out that the bombshell, as it were, hadn't dropped at Lucas Aerospace, and we had time to actually prepare a strategy for when it dropped.
What he's basically saying, Ben, look, all these people are coming along asking for money, asking for save the jobs and all the rest of it, right? And if you want me to do that, you're going to have to give me something. I can't just pluck things out of the air and say it's a good idea to nationalise Lucas Aerospace, right? You come and tell me and give me something. He was basically saying, look, you know the industry, you know what's going on. And then he's saying to the people who should know, who are never given credibility for knowing, the people who work there. The only people who know about industry is the management. People who work in it don't know about it. Just give their lives to it, right? And he said, go away, think of how I can help you. And that's what we did.
Ben offered the idea of a tripart meeting between unions, management and his department, and the combined minutes do record the fact that the debate was really cool on that idea, because the civil servants were against it, and when the officials found out, they were against it, and we were edgy about sitting down, and I think part of that edginess would have meant that the full-time officials would almost have hijacked it.
obviously, at the end of the day, you'd have to talk to management. What we were saying was we weren't going to talk to management to devise a plan. We were devising a plan so that it was complete. Then we were going to talk to management and said, this is it.
We wasn't going to be sitting down with management on a management board, if you like, and
consultative council.
A consultative council, because we knew that the directors would be outside in another meeting making a decision and then bringing it to the worker representatives. So
you just wanted to jump in front of the decision-making process. Instead of reacting, we wanted to be in front of it and let them react. We reversed roles, really.
And then that led to the debate then in January 1975, 2 months after the meeting with Ben, as to what to do. I think it's one of the best debates that's ever been at the Combine, because people were standing up with reservations. Do we have the resources to do our own plan? What if it fails? Somebody made a great comment that they said, well, there's no trade union manual on how to put together a workers' plan. So we were in the dark. And then Mike Cooley stood up and gave a summary to the debate. He summed up what most people had been saying. Now, I think that the only way in which we could be involved in a corporate plan would be if we drew it up in a way which challenged the private profit motive of the company and instead talked in terms of social profit. Take the technology that is used to make the actuators on aeroplane flaps. Those small mechanisms could be used to make artificial limbs for disabled people. If we propose socially useful products, what would be said then? I think it is an insult to our skill and intelligence that we can produce a Concorde and not enough paraffin heaters for all those old age pensioners who are dying in the cold. We have to look at these things now if we are going to do the plan. In my view, the only way we could do it would be in a way that was completely independent of the company. And for me, that was pivotal. That was when it started to turn from should we or shouldn't we collaborate with management to we'll do it on our own. It was the first time I'd heard the phrase socially useful coined.
You're a worker as well as being part of the community. I mean, that's the two things. You can't just see yourself as a worker. Okay, you're going there to get yourself a living, but also you take into account you live in a wider society. Your neighbour's probably got a problem with the kidneys or whatever, so you know there's a connection there, and you see the various things that are going on. You see about the environment, about the fact that we were running out of oil, and it was we had to look at other forms of motivating cars. So you just haven't got this sort of set mind of a worker. That's important, as Mick said. You go there for your wage, and that's understandable. But you also, once you get to a position where you're saying, well, we haven't got enough. They say we haven't got enough work doing this. They wasn't getting the aerospace work. Then I think automatically, if you're going to talk about other products, you're going to talk about something useful because you're a person, you're a human, you're affected by it all.
And that was when the whole notion of the political climate we were in was writ larger, because the government were the main customer of Lucas Aerospace, but somehow there was a political definition of profit at work, that it was profitable to make arms, paid for by taxpayers' money, but not profitable to make life-saving equipment, paid for by taxpayers' money. So there's a pure political definition of profit taking place there. I think what I saw, along with my colleagues around me, was the world around us was not right. The technology was not being used in the interests of ordinary working people. The control of technology and where the money is put into scientific research. It's okay to pour tens of millions of pounds, if not billions, into researching and developing and improving, say, a fighter's manoeuvrability by 2%. That's okay, and that always used to be done on a cost-plus contract, so the company could charge what they want. But, it's not profitable to keep an extra 3,000 people a year alive for want of kidney machines. 3,000 people were dying each year for want of a kidney dialysis machine.
And Lucas already made this particular product, but they were reducing the numbers they were making, and there was, at the same time, there was more of a need.
All of these things at that meeting in 1975 began to coalesce into the concept of doing our own plan, going into completely virgin territory, and actually then using it in a collective bargaining framework. And whilst we knew we were going into uncharted territory with the corporate plan, in a way for us, there was no alternative but to accept the challenge.
Right. The company are saying because the market has contracted, therefore they're going to throw people out on the street. What we're saying is that we can use our expertise, our technology, we can use the existing plant, and we can produce things like kidney machines.
Yeah.
And we should say to the world, this is what we're doing.
Carried unanimously.
We knew that there was so much skill and expertise out there. The problem was, what process should we use to tap those skills and abilities? The first logical step seemed to be to write to the people who'd talked about the desirability of arms conversion for a long time and ask them for their suggestions. A letter was sent out to, I can't remember whether it was 80 or 120 academics who'd talked about this sort of thing before, people who had been advocating disarmament and the need for conversion. And the response was not quite silence, but there were three people responded, and we got nothing else at all from the vast majority of academics, researchers who'd spent their life doing this sort of thing. But when challenged with the actual practicality, I suppose we shouldn't have been surprised, but we were, because we'd always learned to be self-sufficient.
I even sent copies of drawings of the engine management division control systems to academics. Probably I shouldn't have done that. I was probably going against the Official Secrets Act or something. And of course I got no response back, because to them it was just a drawing of a foreign piece of mechanism. And after that I realised that we'd got to do something for ourselves.
So then we did what we should have done in the first place, and that was to send a questionnaire to all our members in the Lucas Aerospace plants, asking them what they could make instead of weapons. And it was basically asking for an audit of the plant and equipment. And some of the sites sent in volumes of it, machine specifications, lists of what they had. Other areas, there was slightly greater than zero.
Because I remember one meeting, one of the members, I won't say his name, oh, he's probably dead now, isn't he? Ron Smith, got up, he said, when I started to talk about, you know, let's be making other things that are, you know, socially useful, he says, but I've always wanted to work on aerospace stuff, you know, and that was how he was. Some people were like that, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. I mean,
they like to work on military stuff. They like to.
They saw it as, you know, that we're working at the top end of the electronic industry. In each plant, there was just a small group of people who latched onto the idea of the corporate plan, and they tried to enthuse the workforce. And the fact that we were eventually threatened with redundancy actually triggered it off, because they could see the sense in finding alternatives to what they were producing.
Actually, the corporate plan and the process of it and talking about alternatives, it was a conscious razor amongst the combine people themselves as well. As Bob said, you know, people like to work in the military complex because they felt it was doing a good thing for the country anyway. They're convinced with the argument. But this was a conscious, what products shall we make? And then you start to think about what we should be making and what would be the answer to society's needs. I think that's, and then once you start putting questionnaires out to the members, they then start to think about it. They think, oh yeah, that's not a bad idea. So you're shifting again from the status quo.
And from that process, we obtained a list of 150 products that we could make in our factories. They came back with 150 products.
When the 150 ideas were all feasible, we had 4 or 5 of the more technically minded people actually sorting out, will this work, will it not? People who actually design parts for aircraft that keeps aircraft in the air. So they weren't airy-fairy, I mean they knew what they were doing, and they knew that the products, based on our facilities, machines, etc., and our skills within the company would be just that, they would be feasible.
And then from that process, the questionnaires were refined into product areas by sort of combined central command, as it were, into the document that's on the table there, which is about as faded as the Dead Sea Scrolls now, the original draft of the corporate plans. And you'll see things in there, cheap, efficient heating systems like heat pumps, propulsion units, such as hybrid engines for motor vehicles. There was power generating equipment. Lucas Aerospace, core business almost, was power generation gas turbines to provide the electricity for aircraft. So in the plan, there is a proposal for wind turbines. An example of a product that came up from, actually wasn't one of our members, it wasn't a union member in our office. He said, I'm against more or less everything that you do, Phil, he said, but I really support this. He'd worked on heat pumps and that kind of technology for a long time, and we actually developed a prototype gas-powered heat pump powered by natural gas.
These ideas are around, it's just a question of bringing them together, of developing them into something that will really work. But it had tapped into the workforce, and if you've got people who had ideas, they wanted their ideas to be known as well. Oceanics, I mean that was, we were talking about developing submarines for mining the sea floor. And submariner mining, it's a fantastic opportunity, but you need the vehicles to do it. And you were looking in terms of that to be finding work, really, not as much for Lucas Aerospace, but for shipyards that were building nuclear submarines. I mean, if you're going to do away with nuclear submarines, you need to give them some purpose in life that draws on their skills and their equipment.
To start to get the jobs issue out of the disarmament debate. You look at trade union policies and you look at Labour Party policy that, subject to an acceptable climate of international relations, we support defence cuts. And then, when the project is cancelled, they go straight to the Department of Trade and Industry and then ask for the restoration of the project. And that's the conundrum that's always faced people in the industry, because no one has ever done before, to our knowledge, a corporate plan that plans for defence cuts. And that's always been the conundrum.
You go to Barra, the old town, absolutely nuclear, right? If you weren't building nuclear submarines, under the present system, there'd be no Barra, never mind no shipyard. So all communities coalesce here. Now, what the corporate plan was saying was you make socially useful products, you make products that will make a profit. And when we look at disarming or look at cutting back on defence, you don't just go to a workforce at Barra and say, we're shutting you down. The work that you take great pride in, and we're going to do away with it all overnight or something, you don't do it. What you do, go to the Barra workforce, what could you do with the skills that you've got, with the capital that you've got, right? What could you do, what could you make if you weren't making that? You can do that to every workforce, right?
Not only to show that jobs could be saved by the manufacture of alternative products, but actually jobs could be created by reductions in military expenditure. How many jobs typically, let's say $1 billion worth of government expenditure could create? So if you spent $1 billion, the sector which gave the fewer number of jobs by far was the military sector. If that had been spent on mass transit, heating systems, solar power, wind generation, all of those sectors would provide more jobs.
And whilst we were looking at the corporate plan in terms of preserving our jobs, we were looking at society in a broader sense. We wanted to broaden it out. And in many respects, it broadened itself out. It took us on paths. Energy. The main areas in energy was conservation of energy and the storage of energy, particularly in housing. To develop designs in building houses that were energy efficient, run in conjunction with the ideas that we had about developing systems with local authorities to support people with design input in building their own houses and building in these energy conservation systems. Then ordinary people who were unemployed could then be put to work building their own house, and it would be designed in such a way as to be energy efficient, both in terms of conserving the energy in the house and maintaining and collecting energy that would be for their use and their community's use.
Let me know when you have it. Light them all up. Come on, fire! Hey, Roger. Keep shooting. Keep shooting.
We're in a period where oil prices had quadrupled. It was just after yet another conflict in the Middle East. So again, the political backdrop to the construction of the plan meant you couldn't actually do anything without thinking of the energy consequences of it. So the conservation of energy in the production process, and then that whole notion of built-in obsolescence, which was a wastage of energy, and Lucas Motors were a past master of that because they were designing motorcar components for obsolescence. Design meeting at Great King Street that Mike used to talk about, where the secondary market for spare windscreen wiper motors was flagging because they were lasting too long. So they reduced the bearing area by 30%, so the windscreen wiper motors
would wear out quicker, so they'd sell more on the spares market. And the cost to the planet in raw materials of that built-in obsolescence type manufacture, which is still with us, isn't it? That things don't last, so they end up on the tip. So you have to mine more scarce materials, you have to fight and wage war over who controls the raw materials. And there was the proposal to try and stop design for built-in obsolescence, and therefore things should be made in a fashion where they could be repaired, and the skills then for repairing cars, washing machines, dishwashers could be taught to perhaps younger people as a means of giving them a skill set, the awareness of energy and repair rather than design for built-in obsolescence.
Young people searching for spare parts on this waste-dumping Ghana wasn't exactly what Phil had in mind. All this no doubt a profitable way to meet EU recycling targets. One of the largest poisonous waste dumps for thrown-away Western goods. Small change to what can be made on the grander world dumping grounds.
In the division where I worked, the engine management division, Lucas, they wanted just to concentrate on aerospace products and didn't really get involved in industrial applications of gas turbines. And some of these gas turbines, I think it was a GG220, was particularly suitable for combined heat and power systems within communities, so that you could have the system, you know, again under the head of energy conservation, using a gas turbine generator. It would provide heat and power for a local community.
Is it a town, is it a city, or is it just an housing estate? You determine the community, then you look at the size of the power plant that you need to do that. The gas turbine, develop the gas turbines, they will give you power, that's your electricity, they will give you your heating, and it will be all in one system. And all you need is the switching gear in each house to control the input into the house from that source. And then you can feed it off to the grid, what's left of it. But it's a community thing. The community have to be involved, they have to discuss it, they have to know what's going on, know how to work it and know how to control it. I mean, you've got to remember that all the systems of sewerage, etc., all goes back to local authorities. I mean, it's not big business that starts these, it's local authorities. Like towns like Birmingham in the 19th century. So we're going back to that in a sense. It's, dare I use the phrase, back to the future sort of thing, that people controlling their own environments, controlling their own energy inputs and outputs, and paying for it, which they do, whether it's big business running it or they're running it for their own use. But the profits, if there are any, are for the community. They're not for whoever, some French-owned outfit that owns the power supply system. It's democratising power supply, if you want.
I mean, I don't think it's just a question of deprivatising the companies. I think they've got to go one step further than that, not just back to the old electricity boards, but to do something back in the communities where it all started from in the first place.
I mean, if you think about the involvement of a community, setting up those systems, which diminishes the influence of the multinational power companies, and it makes them independent of them. So they all have to be involved in the decisions. They all have to be involved in how the system works. They're creating jobs in their own particular economy. And as a consequence of that, this is only one example of how civil society is being used for its own ends. And in the end of the day, I suppose, for its own profit in that sense, if you want to use that term. So it's not just the power supply itself, it's the effect it has on society. I mean, you're taking on the big builders and all the rest of it. I mean, you come up with an idea where 1 million unemployed people can start building houses which are energy efficient and save on the costs. I mean, the building industry is not going to look on that with great, you know, they're not going to have great enthusiasm for it. You'd need government support, finance, local authority support, finance, but the big builders get that anyway. They get government support, they get local authority support, and the housing prices go through the roof, and working people can't afford them. We're saying protect society and develop society in a fair and equitable way. I mean, the system tries to say that that's you, that's them, nothing to do with one another, but we are a society, and if we're going to look at work, and we're going to look at energy, and we're going to look at efficiency, then we have to look at society as a whole. And that's what we're about. That's what Lucas Aerospace was about. Not Lucas Aerospace, but Lucas Aerospace Joint Shop Stewards were about.
And her initial question was still ringing through her brain. Why had their story been lost in the mist of time? Even those looking down from on high can't have missed the thousands of scientists and academics moved to take to the streets in April 2017 in desperation at the wanton denial of the Earth's overwarming.
Look down there. Would you really feel any pity if one of those dots stopped moving forever? If I offered you 20,000 pounds for every dot that stopped, would you really, old man, tell me to keep my money? Or would you calculate how many dots you could afford to spin? Free of income tax, old man. Free of income tax.
40 million of us, she noted, in the UK alone, live in local authorities, like Birmingham, that now have illegally high levels of polluted air. As for homes, tens of thousands of dwellings across Europe, unaffordable for locals, continue to be bought up by investors, many from afar. While across the globe, in a further advance on the empty office blocks of the 70s London skyline, whole cities have been erected that lay eerily empty. China's ghost cities. Like our inflated house prices, built to keep their market economy booming and bereft of social need. But utilities in post-communist Poland, she felt, took the biscuit. These housing blocks have survived, but the free energy they used to receive from a local power station in a system similar to the Lucas Workers Plan has now been privatized, and individual pay meters installed in each flat. What she called neoliberalism's version of Back to the Future.
Thankfully, the alternative plan hadn't yet run its full course.
All right, there'll be a short break while I get Reel 2 organised, so hang on.
Last year, trade unions at ICI presented a positive employment programme to the company that included a section on the environment. It asked ICI to consider itself responsible for the effects of the production process on the whole community and proposed setting up an ICI Central Committee on Environmental Studies with substantial trade union membership and powers to co-opt technical experts.
The workers at CNA Parsons have drawn up a plan for combined heating and energy power stations for communities. Our colleagues in the car industry have drawn up a workers' plan for the automotive industry and the machine tool industry. The rank and file of the trade union movement are rapidly coming to that conclusion, that the old kind of solutions no longer apply.
As far as we can see, there is no way that we can get out of the position that we're in. Difficulties caused mainly by technological advance and the actions of multinationals. There's no way that we can get out of the position that we're in without some long-term strategy.
After we'd sat down as a combine and presented it to Lucas Aerospace directors, they refused to meet us ever again and just issued a paper statement, which again is on the table, which will be to their eternal embarrassment, rejecting the whole thing virtually lock, stock and barrel, including hybrid power pack technology for cars and including wind turbines.
But they never ever once could challenge us on the viability of any product that we'd put forward. I'm not saying they couldn't have done, but they didn't.
They were not respecting us for what we were doing. All they wanted us to be there for was to work, really, to earn our money as they saw it.
We wanted them to get into aerogeneration to save jobs. It says here, wind power, quote, large general duty machines not seen appropriate to the UK. That's the company's reply I've just quoted from. Here it is. The term that management used to discredit that particular proposal for wind turbines was, it's in the realm of the brown bread and sandals brigade, and we're aerospace.
In the electronics department, every time we met the management, they made it clear that they weren't interested in any alternatives. They were just upgrading the electronics on the aircraft side, and they saw that as the future, and they didn't want to know about anything else.
The local management, they became prickly. I mean, Lucas Aerospace was highly centralised in terms of management, and there wasn't much decision-making autonomy. But the difference came, I thought, was when the management publications started to say positive things about what we were doing. For example, Financial Times said the plan is one of the most advanced yet prepared in the United Kingdom by a group of stewards, one of the most radical alternative plans ever drawn up by the workers for their company. Now, that's when I perceived a change, is when their own side, so to speak, started to criticise them. They actually went on television. The management were invited to respond, and a studio discussion was set up. And they all mic'd up, waiting for the discussion to begin, and it kicked off. And the lights in the studio failed, right? And the going was getting a bit tough at that point for the management because they couldn't really answer the simple questions.
back out and just talk to them. The lights went out, and when they came back on a minute or so later, where the management had been sitting, there were empty chairs, and they bolted like rabbits in the night, and that's how confident they were of their own position.
Because if you imagine that they'd have sat down, looked at the product, analysed it, costed it, told us it wasn't viable, then I'm sure the combine would have sat down and listened to it. We'd have listened to what they had to say. And if they could have proven the case, we might have agreed about a particular product. Wouldn't agree on that one, we might agree on that one. Now then, that is collective bargaining. And as far as managements are concerned, collective bargaining doesn't include workers telling them what they should be making. It's not on the agenda for a manager, for any manager. And that's really what the corporate plan, the essence of the corporate plan, is that we're going to be telling you what the product is, which will then gather all the forces that you need to manufacture it. And if you think you can do that with the entrenched power structures you're up against, we are not naive. I think we were very, very challenging to the system, top, bottom. You know, you had your Pope at the top and you came down through your bishops, your priests, blah, blah, blah. And that's exactly how all managements work, everywhere. Top, bottom. And what we wanted to do was say, well, we'll go past management right down to shop floor and then it'll come up. Obviously. You know, you're turning the world on its head. It's absolutely turning the world on its head.
They'd be quite happy for us to negotiate around wages and health and safety. But once you start to talk about the products they make and start to question their policy with regard to putting the money overseas, that's why I think there was a blanket refusal. I mean, it was political. Capital have got all the information and they keep that away from the workers, and the workers are just sort of reacting to what the management are doing, and that's why the trade unions had got a bad name, as I say. I didn't think it was a bad thing, because that's the only thing you could do to take management on. But once you start to become knowledgeable and have information from outside about how companies operate and their corporate policy, then you're going to get the knockback.
Between 1971 and 1977, the total profits they made, 251,400,000. Total tax paid was 10,620,000. Total grants received, that's from the government, was 10,150,000. So the total to the Exchequer was £470,000. But during that period, the total job loss in the UK was 12,500.
It's just profits to Lucas Aerospace. The government were in a position to have some control and say about that. The money that they were putting in to Lucas was taxpayers' money. There's no reason why they couldn't put that taxpayers' money into making things which were socially useful.
CND and peace organisations, certain church groups, Labour Party branches, conferences on new technology, trade unions, the environmentalists were interested. The breadth of the interest was quite mind-blowing.
Because these alternative plans provide a platform for a fight back at the local level.
All of us here used to go out speaking.
Addressing universities, trade unions, car industry, everything, everybody.
And you start to create the links within the community. As you say, you approach the academics, we approach the Socialist Medical Association in Birmingham. You start to do these things, the sort of things that you've never done as a shop steward, but it was a process.
Long life batteries that could power things, mobile, portable kidney machines, heat pumps, solar cells. If we had the running of a company that was prepared to run.
After the management rejected the corporate plan, the Combine felt it was necessary to demonstrate that 2 or 3 of the products that we could afford to build from our meagre Combine and supporter resources could actually be translated into products, socially useful products, that would have technical feasibility. So with the assistance of the North East London Polytechnic, funding was obtained from, I think it was Rowntree's, which helped to develop a hybrid power pack for a Hillman Imp motor car, an electric drive system onto a Hillman Imp, and a control system to demonstrate the viability of a hybrid drive. The other thing that was made at the North East London Polytechnic, we went round fundraising around the sites and bought a single-decker bus and turned it into a road rail vehicle that will drive the local part of the journey on the road and the major part of the journey on rail. The guidance system for that was turned up on our shop floor when it was a summer break and not too many management were around. My wife actually bought the blanks for it from the local dealers. The chassis of it was tested, and the write-up in the Engineer magazine gave it 100% perfect technical performance.
And not only that, when you looked at the fact that you're using pneumatic tyres on a railway vehicle, when you come to build a new railway, you could use concrete tracks. It was about 1/3 of the cost of a conventional railway. It weren't just the fact that it had run on rail and on the roads, which was absolutely, looking at it from a Western perspective, a British perspective, that's what we'd want. But more importantly, looking at the third world, it had saved billions in terms of building infrastructures and allowing them to develop. We were looking at the needs of the third world, talking to people in the third world, and when we came up with the all-purpose power pack, that's what we believed they needed, an all-purpose generator, which could be used for pumping water, could be used for supplying electricity in the fields, a full multi-purpose use. Whereas companies who supply the third world with this type of equipment, they only had single generator, one for water pumping, one for electricity supply, so they wanted to sell them. They also had built-in obsolescence. We were talking about this multi-purpose system. It could also be used in a multi-fuel system. You didn't have to look at particular fuels. You could use the local fuels to generate the power, and it didn't have built-in obsolescence. It could last for years, where the local people could actually maintain their own system. We were trying to overcome the culture, the Western culture. You build that just for that, and then it's no good in 5 years' time. What they needed, rather than what Western companies needed, selling to them.
We could see the success of Kate's, not only from the point of view of producing goods, but also the research facilities that they got that was able to back up the ideas that we had, because we needed that sort of support. And we saw that, you know, these polytechnics and universities were being used by the companies to make money for them, really.
Multinationals pour millions into it. They do it for the research that they get out of it, but they also dictate what the universities are doing, in a sense.
So wasn't it about time these academic institutions gave their expertise to people like us doing a corporate plan? Yeah, we're doing a corporate plan on the universities, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
To our knowledge, it's the first set-up run jointly by academics and industrial workers.
We also have set up a centre in London at the North East London Polytechnic. We've also had many discussions.
Then I heard that Cadbury Trust could make £60,000 available if we could set up a centre in the Midlands area. I was wondering how the best way to approach a university was. I had that discussion with the University of Warwick. They went to the Senate to discuss the idea of us having a unit there. There's a business school there. But they got very clear links with Lucas, and obviously they were frightened off. £60,000 worth of money was, you know, it had funded something for 3 years in those days. It was a good thing. There were people there who wanted to respond to those sorts of initiatives and welcomed it. But the bureaucracy or the management were very hesitant. It was interesting to see what you were dealing with and how they resisted it.
We went to Aston first and got a no response from there.
So we got nothing in Birmingham, really. And in the end, we got this agreement with the Polytechnic in Coventry. And that set up the Unit for Development of Alternative Products. And Jim Schutt, who you were referring to, as a research worker for them, because he came from Chrysler, Jim Schutt did.
And quite early on in the project, there was an electric car that was running around, well, an electric vehicle, a small truck actually, that was running around in Coventry, you know, in the early 70s.
And then the Open University, along with ourselves, had a chat, and we got a project going, and we actually developed a prototype gas-powered heat pump powered by natural gas. Hitherto, they'd been powered by electricity, which wasn't the most thermal efficient way of doing it. And we actually built, they actually built a gas-powered heat pump. And Sheffield City Council became very interested in gas-powered heat pumps, and that interaction partly led to the inclusion of the concept of social use production in the Labour group's manifesto.
The latest government report suggests that this is one of the major means of conserving energy. The company is still saying that that is not a viable product, but we have intercepted one of the company's own market surveys, which shows that the market for these in the domestic sector by 1985 will be 255 million, so nobody can seriously suggest that that's not viable.
Really, to show you what we were gathering here. I was over in research, and this guy came up to me. He was a design engineer or whatever, and he was very polite, and he said, "Excuse me, Mr. Cooney." And, you know, I said, "Call me Mike, you know, call me Mick." And he said, "Well, I've had an idea for many years, and I've been working on it, and putting a lot of money into it, his own money." He said, and I've been looking at management. He said, and just ignore me. He said, and it's the carbon capture. He said, take the carbon out of coal. Because we did a lot of hot-end research, didn't we? Because we had an hot-end research facility. He said, and I think that we can develop a system where coal will take all the poison out of it when it goes up into the atmosphere, and I think I'm cracking this. I said, well, I'll see what we can do about it, you know. And every time he saw me, he said, how are you going on with carbon capture? And I always regret, and I'll regret it to my dying day, that I never ever really pushed that. I mean, you've got all these other problems, but I should have done. We're learning as we go along. And not only developing a corporate plan, in many respects developing ourselves. Because the corporate plan, as it develops, it changes you. We think about that and we're feeling his way and we're making mistakes and all the rest of it. And as we progress, because we're doing what we're doing, we're then looking at ourselves, and you're not the same person at the end of the exercise as you were at the beginning. You're really not. You just change. You see how things are interrelated. You know, when you look at things because capitalism puts you into isolation. You're isolated there, you're isolated there, you're isolated there. Never look at the whole.
She remembered Phil's connecting of things.
Mine more scarce material. You have to fight and wage war over who controls the raw materials.
And how we'd both witnessed, on countless nights, scenes of this battle for control. As those who scan this world from on high seek to maintain their footprint across the globe in a permanent state of war.
To bring peace where there was war, comfort where there was misery, life where there was death. While the conventional political dangers, the threat of global annihilation, the fact of regional war, appear to be receding, we have all recently become aware of another insidious danger. It is mankind and his activities which are changing the environment of our planet in damaging and dangerous ways. It is the prospect of irretrievable damage to the atmosphere, to the oceans, to Earth itself. It's no good squabbling over who is responsible or who should pay. Whole areas of our planet could be subject to drought and starvation.
And she recalled the thrifty housewife, casting herself above the squabbling children in her midst, as only those who assume to have civilized the world can.
And something often forgotten, Mr. Speaker. She was the first political leader in any major country to warn of the dangers of climate change. Long before...
Who would suspect her government were emptying the North Sea of its oil? What she called God's gift to the British economy. that funded her famed 1980s boom. Like her conflation of dictatorship and freedom, the connection between climate change and the drive for not only profits, but continual profit growth, seemed to elude her.
We must resist the tendency to blame modern multinational industry for the damage which is being done to the environment. We must have continued economic growth in order to generate the wealth required to pay for the protection of the environment. The market itself acts as a corrective.
Can a multinational solve the problem of where we're going with the environment? They don't even ask the question. They don't say where's our products and our systems taking the environment. It's just, will this make us a profit? And if it will make a profit, then it's made. If we can't get the toxic emissions down, let's tell lies about it. And I don't think Volkswagen are on their own there. I mean, this is part of the pressure that comes on to a management. It happens in most industries. But if you look at what's happening in the third world, I mean, it's really horrendous. And the only way it's going to happen is by new ways of approaching society and the way involving society in the way things happen, as we've said in the products that we've mentioned.
Here was a group of shop stewards really advancing the argument for sustainability in the 70s, and management dismissing it, and the cost to the planet shows the lack of responsibility the management displayed.
I think by its very nature, they couldn't solve the problem, even if they wanted to, even if they decided, you know, tomorrow I want to make the world a better place, because they would find that they would lose their competitive edge against other companies and other countries, and therefore you know, they are trapped almost in having to do what their shareholders, if you like, are demanding of them, because they are as vulnerable as anybody else in the capitalist system. So it wasn't about individuals, it was about the system which operates in that particular way. Isn't a brave new world now?
And they hired companies who hired hands to tell stories, camera, action, sound. As sure as cars were replenishing the air we breathe, as sure as junk food was the very best, those caught in the crossfire of their perpetual war, a factory in Yorkshire, a village in a far-off land, were endlessly pictured in crisis, the victims depicted as the cause. And this is where we got caught up, in the drama of resisting, unaware of the extent of the Lucas workers' plans. And other shop stewards, as well as progressive local authorities, who were resisting by calling for more socially useful lives.
The shop stewards at the Chrysler car plant here in Coventry could see car production wasn't going to provide them or their families and their kids with a viable long-term future. The stewards were trying to force management to stop petrol and diesel engine production and trying to get them to diversify into a wider range of product that could help and develop sustainable technologies.
One of the most impressive consequences of what you did was the impact it had on local authorities. Sheffield was one example. The Greater London Council was another. I worked in the popular planning unit, and we were a very radical administration with a very radical manifesto.
Our strategy is based on saying, well, profit hasn't solved the problems of the economy either in Britain or internationally, and that maybe shouldn't be our guide, that shouldn't be our compass. Instead,
and the GLC were exploring how best to promote social growth in areas where whole communities were being closed down.
Now, when we arrived, as employees of this radical administration, there was somebody there who was meant to be guiding and supporting us in relation to the whole administrative machinery. When she showed us to our offices, which were a kind of showroom at the edge of County Hall, she said, your job is to attract private industry to London. And we looked at some of the propaganda that was lying on the table of this showroom, and it had a leaflet basically giving a league table of the wage levels of different cities, big cities in Europe, trying to show that London had the lowest wages, London workers had the lowest wages, and that this was a reason for industry to come to London. The traditional approach of the state in a mixed economy, the state would provide the infrastructure for private industry. So, for example, when Ford came to London, the Greater London Council provided the homes for the workers, the transport, all the infrastructure that enabled Ford's to make its profits. 20 years later, Ford's just disappears, just decides that it's no longer in its interest to be in London. It's more profitable to go somewhere else. Their wages are lower and the trade unions maybe are weaker. So we had to try and reverse that process. Workers unemployed, communities breaking up, housing deteriorating. We completely reversed that and in fact said, actually, we're going to start from the skills and capacities of the workers of London. So when there was a problem in Docklands, high unemployment, communities facing huge problems of poverty, of bad housing, and what the government was doing was imposing a basically market-led development corporation that then decided to build an airport which would really serve the city, essentially, commuting city bankers flying to Frankfurt and so on, in which effectively would drive the people out of that area and break up the communities. And so what we did, which learnt very much from what you did, wasn't say, OK, we've got an alternative plan, we, the planners, the experts, can show what needs to be done. We said, well, the people are already organising and resisting because they don't feel this airport meets their needs. So as part of the popular planning unit, I would go down to Docklands, meet local people, sit in on their meetings and discuss with them what they wanted. And they decided that what they wanted was to develop a plan based on the ideas of people in the community, and that they wanted to set up what they call the People's Plan Centre, to which people could come with their ideas and which also employed a range of people who had different kinds of expertise and who would go out to talk to people, small business people, ex-dockers, women involved in different kinds of industries and just drawing on their own community experience. And the GLC was like a resource. It wasn't the planner. It was a resource for the capacity of the people working together to develop their own plan. The people's plan for the Royal Docks.
It actually is a people's plan. It's not a surveyor. I mean, none of these people have been trained. It's just their own ideas of planning their own area.
These Royal Docks are the biggest bit of real estate in Europe. The biggest bit of real estate and the most expensive bit of real estate. And the LDDC wants that real estate. And like all good rackman like landlords, they want miners to sit in tenant.
And I would like to see Newham Council, the GLC, get hold of that land and say, right, we're going to start thinking about local people and their living environment, and we're going to build those houses and we're going to get rid of those tower blocks. That's me personally.
We want that little dock there, the Albert Dock Basin, for our children. To bring them up in a place like that. Let them enjoy what their fathers, their grandfathers and so forth that built them docks. Let them have the benefit of it. Up to now, they've got the benefit of nothing.
You know, this was their area, not just that they lived there, but their own family had been involved in actually, you know, producing the wealth in that area that went into making it, you know, an important part of the British economy. And this is why they felt really strongly that they should be able to enjoy the area and enjoy the benefits of any regeneration of the areas. So we tried to actually support workers as citizens into an alternative democratic planning system.
A particularly arrogant response that I'll quote from the plan on, which is the response of the leading barrister for the Docklands Development Corporation. He said, "We're prepared to listen to alternatives from a statutory body, from the GLC or Newham Council, but the people's plan, ridiculous," he said. "I've never heard of such a thing."
A stone's throw away from the people's plan for Docklands, we'd come to a British steel plant. 13 workers had been sacked here for participating in a day of community action against their local hospital's closure, and had now occupied their works. With the management off the site, they came across documents revealing company plans to move out of this traditionally militant trade union area and relocate to Enfield, employing half the amount of men. British Steel, like Ford's and Lucas, were rationalising, and a padlocked drawer in the general manager's office reveals the plotting behind their plans.
We had a long session on whether we should break the padlock off or not. So eventually 2 people sort of smashed the padlock off, and then nobody would open the drawer. It was sort of that feeling, you know, that you mustn't do it, you know, you're a naughty boy sort of thing. And I opened the drawer, and as soon as I opened the drawer, there was about these 8 sets of hands that just went crunch and pulled out all these papers, and everything was flying about, you know, it was terrible. And we come across these documents. It was unbelievable. I mean, one of them, Ray Duffin, we had to take him home when we see what was in the files about him.
September 75. Mr. Roebuck contacted local Greenwich CID, and a Mr. Maynard from Scotland Yard came to see me, at which time he outlined the whole problem to him. He told me that he'd already checked on the 2 most likely persons responsible. Mr. Lutner. Special branch have files on this man for his political activities. They have 4 complaints against him on file: distributing socialist literature, disturbing the peace during demonstrations, taking part in illegal demonstrations.
Illegal demonstrations, already a category on the CID computer. But it wasn't only the special branch contributing to the Works Managers file. The Economic League, an organisation blacklisting trade union activists, was also part of the network.
Mr. C. Duffin, an ex-crane driver from Dockland area. One is not aware of the implications of employing a docker. We were desperately short of mobile crane drivers, and in view of the above clearance, we took him into our employ. Can we please not take into our employment any person without first obtaining references that satisfy us of their background?
They say about a Ray Duffin docker, don't employ him. And as Paul said earlier, this is a ex-Dockland area. You're going to have thousands of dockers out of work. And yet it's apparently the policy of a nationalised industry not to employ dockers. Oh, I think the thing about those documents is the fact that as far as BSC is concerned, and as far as the TUC movement is concerned, this plant is a nothing plant. I mean, 100 people, it's just not worth anything. And we've got those documents in a plant like this, which is 2 years old. It's got virtually no history, and yet they've got files like that on workers here. So what have they got in bigger, well-established British Steel places? And then it goes on to other nationalised industries as well. And the fact that taxpayers' money is being put into the Economic League, which it must be. I mean, you've got to put money into the Economic League to get information out. And that the Economic League is anti-nationalisation, and yet the Labour government is indirectly putting money into it.
A new world was emerging, she wrote. 1,000,000 miles from the aspirations in the Lucas and People's plans. And every bit as controlling as the day Mike first entered the factory gates. New technologies, she hastened to add, were being forcefully introduced. The London docks moved to a containerised port at Tilbury. The Sun newspaper to its whopping high-speed print works. Both employing fewer hands, breaking long-established working practices, demanding flexibility and a faster rhythm of work.
I mean, they were saying give a year for the nation, weren't they? And 6 months hard work. And Jack Jones with his year, the year of the beaver, the eager beaver. But I mean, where is the line coming from the management? Especially nationalised management, where they're using scab organisations like the Economic League and also using the special branch. I mean, it just shows the lengths they'll go to now.
We have pieced together our model community of the future, a town which has embraced technology wholeheartedly and taken full advantage of all it has to offer. So perhaps one feature of our community of the future will be a centre for human achievement, a building where people can make a choice, where they can be matched by computer with the best outlet for their abilities.
Millions and millions of people may disappear from the rat race. Machines will replace so many jobs, the drudgery of daily life may be the struggle to find things to do, filling in the time, utilising our leisure.
They promised us more leisure time, and the problem would be how to spend the leisure time. But we found all those lucky enough to be left in employment found themselves subject in the white-collar areas to an intensification of the work rate. And so the concept of the socially useful production process was advocated in the plan. Socially useful products produced in a more socially desirable way.
Countries which get in quickly on the robot revolution will reap tremendous rewards.
And if we do not invest in word processing and, as I said, these other areas in the way that I described, then we will simply not be competitive.
If we don't move now, and move very, very quickly, both large and small companies alike, I think we run a major risk of losing competitiveness.
We still have time to stay in this race if we run very hard now.
Good morning, authorisation. May I have your merchant number?
They introduced new technology because they were trying to compete with other countries or other companies. And the more new technology comes in, inevitably there will be more pressure.
The trend in industry at the time was to fragment and de-skill the production process. But what we were interested in was to upskill the production process.
In the not too distant future, engineering is going to consist of people who come to work, press a button, and the job gets done, which is great. The job gets done, it probably gets done quicker, probably more efficient. But there's going to be a time come when nobody is going to be able to do a job on their own. They'll just be able to press buttons, they won't be able to actually make anything on their own, out of their own skills. Personally, I like to be able to come and use my hands and use the little bit of skill I've got and get some satisfaction out of actually making something.
They're eliminating human energy and human intelligence by machines. And the reason they do this is they believe that by reducing labour costs, that will render their industry more efficient. The worker is controlled by the machine rather than the other way round, that they be reduced to almost a machine appendage, simply reacting to the system rather than acting upon it. And it will give the employers enormous control over them.
That was a view, and a lot of arguments about it. One of the outcome, as far as I was concerned, and as far as most people were concerned, is that whilst we believed it was neutral at the beginning, we certainly didn't believe it at the end of these debates, because you could actually give examples.
At Marston Green, there was a dispute where parity with the computers was being claimed by the white-collar staff. The computers had been given air-conditioned rooms to work in, whilst the designers worked in essentially drafty sheds. So the dispute was about parity with the computing equipment.
The introduction of computer-aided design really fundamentally changed the atmosphere within the drawing and design office. All of a sudden the machines were taking over from the people. The joke was that the designers and the draftsmen were, are they dozing off, or are they doing some work? There was the thinking time that was involved in that sort of work, and once the computer-aided design came in, that creativity was stifled.
White-collar workers were now having methods of work imposed upon them in the way that they imposed their methods of work on the shop floor.
The computer comes along and it gives them the methods of really timing to infinitesimal times the work of a white-collar worker, just as the stopwatch controls blue-collar work. The computerisation of work in the white-collar areas, controlling white-collar work, in fact, it's probably more controlled.
The draftsmen controlled the pace at which they worked, but as soon as they brought in computer-aided design, the machines started to control the pace.
It's somebody sits in front of a computer, and the computer actually does the drawing. You know, you can put dimensions in and that sort of thing, but it's the computer that actually does the drawing. It was all the younger blokes that were trying to use it. I would imagine it was a bit soul destroying after you've learned to use it. It would be very boring.
Before, you'd have a design engineer, you'd have a draftsman, you'd have test engineers, and they'd all put the contributions in, but all this would be in the it wasn't in there at that time. Don't forget, this was a developing system. But the whole idea was that all these people who put them inputs in wouldn't be necessary, because the computer would have them in its software, and the only thing the computer operator did was to bring them out and put them onto paper. All these people who put them inputs in wouldn't be necessary. And some of the technical workers, don't forget the combine was manual workers and technical workers. And some of the technical workers were right at the forefront in terms of design. And they were being paid to design what was going to be CAD/CAM. And they could see it. These systems, computerisation in some of the highest skilled white-collar areas, is now all controlling.
What they wanted to do was steal our knowledge and skills, and then at the end of it, throw us out the door.
They could see it coming, and they were telling us, this is what's coming, folks. Be prepared. They're going to design this technology to suit them. You should make sure that the technology is designed to suit you and society. You being part of society in a sense. So then you sort of broaden the outlook and think, we're not just shop stewards representing Lucas Aerospace, we, in a sense, representing society, in a sense. Because we weren't narrow, we didn't, you know, we were going out all over the place, telling everybody, come on folks, get on board.
Technology was made by human beings. It's not given, it's not like the sun or the moon or the stars. It was designed by people, and we could design it differently. That we regard human skill, ability, creativity, and sheer enthusiasm as assets rather than liability. And we design the equipment around that. But it seems to me the options are not so much technological questions as political and ideological ones. What kind of society do we want? How do we want people to relate to production and each other? When we get that clear, we could design it differently.
We shall not be moved.
Our task, if we want a responsible society, is to give responsibility to ordinary people and take away the privilege from a minority who have dominated this country for too many centuries.
We felt that there was some kind of sympathy from the Labour government which would allow what we were doing to have some more legitimacy.
Government's financial support, really.
Well, financial support, but also to put influence on Lucas, because the government was funding these contracts. Rather than people being thrown out of work, if they were funding that, they could fund other things as well.
And it was to the question of implementing Labour's pre-election ideas that Wilson also turned. First sacking Tony Benn as Minister of Industry, and then putting himself in charge of a very different kind of change.
There was a sea change in as much that when Ben moved from industry, any chance of us achieving any support from the government had gone. I mean, Varley, wasn't it? Eric Varley who took his place, and I think he ended up as a director in some private company afterwards.
As many of them did.
As many of them did. So there was nothing there at all. It could have been a Conservative government, as far as we could see. But apart from individual MPs did try their best. Jeff Rucker was supportive, Audrey Wise was supportive, but it was only individual MPs really who were supportive. Support from the government had gone, They turned their backs on us, and they were actively collaborating with the company behind our backs.
With Wilson now in charge of implementing industrial policy, no longer concerned with holding speculators to account, everything was to be moved back behind ministerial walls, with only managing directors, financiers and the official trusted representatives of the labour movement welcome. And a particularly nasty sting in the tail for the Lucas shop stewards.
We all had credentials from our own unions. We were all elected by people in the workplace, so we were all official representatives of our unions. The moment that we ganged together as a combine, we were viewed as an unofficial organisation, which was true, sad to say, but true.
Lucas discovered, if they didn't already know, they'd understand the structure of the unions, right? They called us from day one an unofficial body. We were all official trade union reps, we all had credentials from his own union, but as a group we were unofficial. So the position the management took will only talk to the official unions. Now then, you can see Harold Wilson's eyes lighting up, and the Parliament, not the Parliamentary Labour Party, but the government. Right, yeah, yeah. They're not refusing to discuss it, they're refusing to discuss it with an unofficial body. You've got to agree with this, haven't you? You know, this is their position. And what they discover is that the Confed has national officials in charge of different industries. And Ken Gill is in charge of aerospace, and he's the task general secretary. So Ken Gill then becomes the spokesman for Lucas Aerospace shop stewards. He's now representing us.
Yeah.
As far as Lucas Aerospace and their management is concerned, and as far as the Labour government's concerned, that's it. They've managed to, from a purely propaganda point of view, everybody outside can say, yeah, well, you can understand they have to speak to the official unions, and Ken Gill's it. It's nothing to do with the engineering section of the AEU, nothing to do with the T&G, nothing to do, but that's it. And they are talking to Ken Gill. What they're saying to him, we don't know. But from a company point of view, from a Labour point of view, it was brilliant.
I think Aaron Bevan called it the green slime of Westminster. And everything that's just been said, just as a reminder, was after the Labour Party conference voted unanimously to support the Lucas Aerospace workers. In fact, some people are cynical, and they argue the stronger the support at Labour Party conference for an action, the less likely it is to happen.
It's what's up front's one thing, and what goes on behind the closed doors is another.
What is clear from another file we found was that the union officials have time and time again worked in close cooperation with the British Steel Corporation to break the plant organisation down here.
It's been proven to us by various papers we've found here in the occupation here, such as when we was on strike on safety outside the gate in January, that the actual boundary of the trade union turned around and said in a telephone conversation with management, well, we'll stand by what we agreed of yesterday and let them sweat it out. That means letting us sweat it out on strike outside the gate instead of what a trade union official should have done, which came out in support of us, supported us all the way down the line, but he hasn't supported us all the way down the line. What he's done is supported management all the way down the line.
Were they all just bad eggs? Or, to paraphrase Brian, like managers, trapped, holding on to their place in the system?
One thing she did know, caught between supporting those doing the work and company profit margins, something always has to give.
Things came to a head at the end of '78 when the company announced that they wanted to close Victor Works with a loss of about 1,400 jobs initially, and I think it was about 500 jobs in the electrical division. The company had set the stall out then. They'd rejected the corporate plan idea, the alternative project, and they'd set the stall out. And this report was produced by the Combine, destroying the company argument that there wasn't the work there for them. And that was the reason that they were cutting the workforce. And the social costs to the government, the taxpayer, saying how much it would cost if people were thrown out of work, and therefore it was in the government's interest to keep those people employed, making things which were socially useful.
The threat of redundancy of about 2,000 in Lucas Aerospace. That will cost us around about £250,000 a week in unemployment benefit.
And also they linked the relationship between the Department of Industry and Lucas Aerospace, where Anthony Part, was it? Anthony somebody?
Sir Anthony Part.
Anthony Part went from the Department of Industry and went onto the Lucas Aerospace board, or Lucas Industries board. And so there was seeing a close tie-up between the government and the company. And in effect, at the end of the day, the government, behind our backs, through Kaufman, I suppose, provided, how much was it, 6 million to buy a new site in Huyton.
To build a new
factory in Huyton, close the one at Victor Works, in effect destroy 500 jobs, and the government were going to give them £6 million or whatever.
Oh, you have to remember who the MP for Huyton was. The MP
Wilson.
for Huyton was Harold Wilson.
Wilson.
Let's not forget that.
They realised that they weren't going to have any problem with the government. They weren't going to have any problem with the trade unions.
And Lucas has ended up with a more modern factory and newly equipped.
And as an aside, the new Chief Exec of Lucas Aerospace, James Blythe.
Sir James Blythe.
James Blythe ended up in the Ministry of Defence when he left Lucas Aerospace. He ended up working for the Ministry of Defence as an arms salesman, a super arms salesman.
Lucas saw that as a victory. Yeah. And it was for them. And then they started to institute proceedings to get rid of Ernie and then Mike Cooley, because they'd been given tacit approval, I strongly believe, to do that. Had they not, they wouldn't have tried it on.
This would represent what the Labour Party is supposed to stand for, a real fundamental shift in power to workers themselves. And this is what it's all about, and this is what companies like Lucas are terrified of.
The situation changed just at the end of the 70s, and such ideas that we were putting forward could no longer be accepted, that we had to be put in our place. The ideas had to be put in their place, and the individuals had to be put in their place. And if that meant sacking the individuals, they would do it.
The alternative plan, she wrote, never received a penny of government support. 10 months after the sacking of Mike Cooley and Ernest Scarborough, the announcement of a further 2,000 redundancies at the Burnley plant gave a boost to Lucas Industries' stock market shares. Six months after filming British Steel's files on the engagement and dismissal of employees, she added, the factory was moved to Enfield with half the original workforce. And part of this quiet corner of Docklands was transformed into a civil disorder and riot training ground. Six years later, a new government, even more attuned to business needs, abolished the GLC and its popular planning unit, and an unelected body of city businessmen gave a green light to the London City Airport.
Aimed at discerning passengers looking for a smooth and effortless journey, it's the UK's fastest airport for business travel.
The UK's fastest airport, whatever was being sold.
And she landed at her journey's start, still calling on her memories of real but very different stories. And trying to picture how we'd lost their thread, how we'd managed to lose our bearings and arrive at a time so big on price and so low on social value. And despite all the talk, government's still spending 4 times more on climate-changing fossil fuels than sustainable energy. And science, more fearful by the day, that all major cities are heading for a future knee-deep in more than a pea soup. And then, she asked, where would we be heading? And what would be worth fighting for?
You can't wake up one morning and say, we'll have a corporate plan. I mean, it has to be worked at. It has to be developed. It has to be nurtured and moved on and given time to grow. We weren't then going to be able to develop that. We weren't be able to go to nurture it. It's about undermining. So if it's multinationals good, help, support, attract, don't upset them. Privatisation was good, state was bad, state had to be diminished. She had to attack the trade union movement, weakening trade unions. It was an all approach supported by important elements in society, supported by, to a degree, the Labour Party. It's no use the Labour Party washing their hands and saying it's all Thatcher. They were part of it. It was a philosophical view of the world, the mentality of there's only one way, money, money, money. And all we were doing at Lucas Aerospace in those years was saying there are alternatives to what you're being told. All you've got to do is open your eyes and look at them. That can't be legislated for hook, line and sinker. Legislation can only be put in place that supports society, where at the moment legislation supports big business, supports the city, supports banks. The fact is they spend billions and billions and billions, does state governments, which they pour into private companies. That's okay, right? But if you want to put a few 100,000 or a few million into socially useful product, no, that's the market. It's not about economics in the sense of what's good for society, it's about what's good for one group of people. And the managers running the whole outfit, we have no control over them from anybody. People believe that shareholders don't control them, and they just write the checks and write their own salaries. That's the system, right? We see highly trained people coming out of universities who are working at McDonald's, zero-hour contract. And the wages are appalling, right? I mean, I also remember my parents thinking they wanted, and my grandparents, better futures for the children. We don't seem to be right bothered about a future for our children now. I might be wrong on that, and I hope I am, but nobody's actually saying I'm making a better world for my children, because they aren't making the world. The multinationals are. And according to the powers that be, civil society is not civil society. It's nothing other than a consumer to supply the markets. It's not that business is there to supply civil society. And all the decisions are made in Detroit, in Japan. They're not made in England, right? All they come here for is to get if there's crumbs off the government table, let's get them and let's get in there.
And offering much more than crumbs to those who want to get in there, the youngest ever French president would announce a brand new plan, featuring shades of Harold Wilson, in a back-to-the-70s future for the new global players. a loosening of labour regulations, and more powers to corporations to set the hours and conditions of work.
You know how many committees we have at Apple? 0. We have no committees.
But the coolest techno-cat of them all would make a more philanthropic claim.
Apple's an incredibly collaborative company. And there's tremendous teamwork at the top of the company, which filters down to tremendous teamwork throughout the company.
And how did this team work? Like the Native Americans in 50s westerns, the iGadget assembly workers, driven to riot against prison-like treatment on the very day Apple launched a new iLine, were cast as extras, peripheral, simply didn't count in the Steve Jobs tale.
For this, she wrote, is where the East and Western systems, while fighting over territory, have always tended to converge. Taylor's stopwatch, being used to bolster production in Soviet Russia as early as the 1920s. And once inside the workplace, you could just as well have been back in the land of the free. In the end, she wrote, it comes down to story and the importance the apparatchiks of the East and entrepreneurs like Jobs have bestowed on themselves. And as she watched one of these global players work the crowd, she added, not only were his eye things made in modern Chinese slave camps, but this whole eye circus, like the first piece of moving entertainment, was designed as much to conceal. Like the myth of equality in his company, it wasn't freewheeling capitalists who led the development of their much heralded information age. The internet and every one of the key technologies eye things need were developed not in Silicon Valley as we've been led to believe, but by the same source that's always created social infrastructure, public sector development and research. And while governments have handed out millions to nurture, develop, and when necessary come to the rescue of companies like Apple, their profits in the blink of a Steve Jobs eye seem to magically make their way offshore. All that publicly funded skill and talent used by those who look down on this world as a means to one end.
Money, 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 money.
And the best they can offer, various states of insecurity, and the chance to be in their race. Or not. To increase the billions they've gained.
the amount of money that the government is giving to these corporations, corporate welfare. Nobody ever mentions this. Nobody mentions this in the press. And when you think about the bank bailout in 2008, I mean, it's very difficult to get the true figures of how much was put into the banks to keep them afloat. I mean, I've got 456 billion, with quantitative easing being 332 billion. There's a lot of money there that's been put into the system. And what they're doing now, they're paying bank bonuses again. They're back to where they were. You know, public service workers getting nothing, getting 1% or very little. And when you think the big discussion was about cutting the welfare budget by 12 billion, and you know, they're blaming ordinary people for what happened. I know you can't compare ordinary, not, you know, extraordinary working people and the slaves as it was, but the abolishment of slavery took place in 1834, and the equivalent of £17 billion was paid in compensation. Who to?
Slave owners.
The owners, not the slaves. The slaves had to work for free for the following 6 years. Now, I know you can't equate slavery with ordinary...
It's not a bad analogy.
But it's not a bad analogy, is it? That, you know, people, they had to pay for something that they hadn't been responsible for. And I think it's exactly the same. There's a job to be done. There is a job to be done.